Beneath the Ministry of Magic in the sealed chambers of the Department of Mysteries, the unspeakables worked in a silence that felt older than the stone around them. Their robes, dark as still water, moved without sound as they gathered around an artifact recovered from a forgotten tomb beneath the Carpathian Mountains. It was a shard of blackened bone bound in silver runes, humming with a resonance no instrument could measure. For centuries, wizarding scholars had believed it to be a fragment of a cursed relic older than the first written spell. Tonight they intended to look inside it. The lead unspeakable raised his wand, whispering incantations older than the founding of Hogwarts itself. The runes on the floor flared and reality trembled. What they expected was a glimpse into memory, a whisper of the past bleeding into the present. What they received was something else entirely. The spell did not open time, it opened distance. It reached across the veil between realities, brushing against a world where power was neither summoned nor spoken, but drawn from the deepest hollows of the human soul. In that distant world, 4 arms moved through smoke and ruin. Ryomen Sukuna, the king of curses, stood amid the corpses of sorcerers who had believed themselves capable of ending him. He felt the pull before he understood it, a thin thread of unfamiliar magic curling around his essence like a child tugging at a tiger's tail. He smiled with the calm amusement of something that had never known fear. Then the thread pulled, and the world he knew fell away. His arrival on the other side made no sound. There was no thunder, no flash of light, no storm of displaced air. He simply stepped into a corridor of stone somewhere within the belly of Hogwarts, as though he had always been meant to walk there, and yet the castle knew. Every enchanted portrait along the walls froze in place, their painted subjects staring outward with an unnatural stillness. Sir Cadogan lowered his sword and did not speak. The fat lady stopped mid-song, her mouth open, her eyes wide. Deep in the dungeons, the ghosts of Hogwarts vanished without warning, drawn into hidden places between the walls where even they could not be found. House elves refused to leave their alcoves. In the forbidden forest, the centaurs turned their gaze toward the castle and lowered their bows in a silence heavier than mourning. Magic itself seemed to hold its breath. At first, the students noticed nothing beyond the strange stillness of the paintings, but then the deaths began. A 7th-year Ravenclaw was found collapsed in a corridor near the astronomy tower, her wand unbroken, her body untouched. A Hufflepuff prefect was discovered slumped against a suit of armor with no wound and no memory of pain on his face. Healers found no curse, no hex, no residue of dark magic. The bodies had simply been crushed beneath something invisible, as though the air itself had grown too heavy for them to bear. Professor McGonagall stood over the third body with a stillness that unnerved even Phileas Flitwick. She recognized the horror for what it was. This was not dark magic. It was not any magic she had ever studied. It was something that predated their entire vocabulary of fear. Dumbledore and Snape walked the corridors together in the deep hours of the night. Where the victims had fallen, they found faint traces of an energy that resisted every diagnostic charm they cast. It clung to the stone like an oil that could not be washed away. Snape's jaw tightened. Dumbledore said nothing for a long time. Sukuna, meanwhile, wandered the castle with the detached curiosity of a traveler who had grown bored of empires. He watched the moving staircases with mild amusement. He looked upon the living paintings as one might regard insects trapped in amber. He observed the students hurrying between classes and understood, in a single glance, that they wielded power without ever truly owning it. Their strength came from wands, from words, from external instruments. None of them had ever looked inward and found something worth fearing. To him, they were fragile. A few, however, sensed him without knowing why. Harry. Potter woke that night from a dream he could not describe, his scar cold rather than burning, his breath caught in a chest that felt suddenly small. Hermione Granger, unable to sleep, drifted into the library and pulled down a book she had never intended to open. Within its yellowed pages, she found a phrase repeated in 3 different dead languages: souls that devour kingdoms. Luna Lovegood stood alone at a window on the 4th floor, gazing at the moonlit grounds. She spoke without turning to the friend behind her. "The castle is afraid," she said. No one believed her. It was Dumbledore who finally saw him. Late in the evening, from a courtyard below the astronomy tower, the headmaster looked upward and beheld a figure standing against the moon, tall, still, marked with lines that seemed carved into the sky itself. For the briefest moment their eyes met across the impossible distance, and Albus Dumbledore, who had faced Grindelwald without flinching, felt the ground shift quietly beneath his certainty. For the first time in decades, he hesitated. By dawn, the ministry had been notified, though no one within its polished halls truly understood what they had been told. Reports spoke of unclassified deaths, of magic behaving in ways the textbooks had never described, of a presence within Hogwarts that the wards could neither identify nor expel. The Wizengamot convened in urgent session, and every seasoned voice offered a familiar explanation. A dark wizard of unknown lineage, an ancient spirit released from a broken seal, a possessed human vessel bearing forbidden knowledge, a demon summoned by careless hands. Each theory shattered against the truth within a day. Aurors were dispatched in pairs, then in squads, then in full battalions. Those who returned came back changed, unable to articulate what they had faced. Those who did not return left behind only silence and unbroken wands. The ministry raised layered enchantments around the castle grounds. Sukuna walked through them without breaking stride, and the enchantments did not so much fall as forget they had ever existed. Cursed energy did not obey the assumptions upon which wizarding society had been built. It did not respond to counterspells. It did not shatter under detection charms. It moved through their careful architecture like wind through an open door. Dumbledore withdrew into the archives. He read forbidden texts kept behind 3 locks in the deepest vault of the Hogwarts library. He requested records from Gringotts that no goblin had shared in over 1,000 years. He consulted centaur prophecies whispered only during equinoxes, and pored over the remnants of magical civilizations that had crumbled long before Merlin drew his first breath. Every path of study led him to the same terrible conclusion. What the wizarding world called darkness was only a shadow of something far older, and their understanding of evil had always been comfortably incomplete. Harry felt it before he understood it. The scar on his forehead had gone cold and remained cold, a numbness that frightened him more than any burning. When Sukuna moved through a corridor 2 floors below, the fragment of Voldemort's soul within Harry recoiled with a violence that dropped him to his knees. He gasped in the darkness of his dormitory, sweat cooling on his skin, unable to explain to Ron why a piece of the darkest wizard in living memory was suddenly terrified of something else. Snape observed the change with the quiet, calculating attention he reserved for problems that could not yet be named. He knew the rhythms of Harry's scar the way a healer knows a patient's pulse. Whatever had entered Hogwarts, the Horcrux within the boy recognized it as a predator, and Voldemort, wherever he brooded in the world beyond, would feel that recognition eventually. Sukuna moved through the castle now with the languid patience of a scholar in a foreign library. He watched charms lessons from unseen corners. He listened to transfiguration lectures without any apparent interest in the material. What fascinated him was not the magic itself, but the assumption behind it, the shared conviction that strength lived outside the body, that the wand was the source rather than the conduit. He saw children with extraordinary potential who had never once been asked to look inward. He saw professors of tremendous skill who had never trained their souls to hold a single ember of will. The ministry sent its finest. A dozen elite aurors, veterans of the last war, cornered him in the ruins of a courtyard the castle had quietly abandoned centuries earlier. They struck with combinations rehearsed for a lifetime. Chains of spells woven together with the precision of a symphony. Sukuna did not counter them. He simply smiled, tilted his head, and stepped between their arcs of light as though walking through open doorways. When it ended, he had not raised a hand. The aurors stood breathing hard, uninjured, and yet defeated in a way none of them could explain. They had not been overpowered. They had been unseen. Dumbledore came to him that evening, alone, without wand drawn. He climbed to the top of the astronomy tower where Sukuna had chosen to stand each night, and the 2 of them looked out over the grounds together as though they were the last 2 thinking beings in the world. They spoke for hours, not of war, of purpose. Dumbledore argued that power existed to protect what could not protect itself, that restraint was the highest expression of strength. Sukuna answered that power existed because the strong shaped the world and the weak lived within the shape it took, and that mercy without capacity was only cowardice with a kind name. Neither convinced the other. Neither expected to. But when Dumbledore turned to leave, Sukuna spoke once more, quietly. "You are the first here who did not bore me," he smiled then, and it was not the smile of a monster. It was the smile of a man who had at last found something interesting. Whatever balance had held Hogwarts together for 1,000 years began to slip in the days that followed. The castle had always possessed a certain quiet awareness, a memory embedded in its stones by the four who had raised it. That memory now stirred. Doors that had been sealed since the age of the founders began to unlock themselves at odd hours. Corridors rearranged their paths without regard for the enchantments that supposedly governed them. In the sub-basements, iron gates that no living wizard had ever opened swung inward on hinges that should not have moved. The professors gathered in the staff room in a silence that had once belonged only to funerals. McGonagall reported that the 7th floor had grown an additional corridor overnight, one that ended in a door marked with a rune none of them could read. Flitwick spoke of hearing voices singing in a language older than Old English, drifting up from the lake at midnight. Pomona Sprout said the greenhouses had begun turning their flowers away from the castle, as though even the plants had chosen a side. Dumbledore listened without speaking, his long fingers steepled beneath his beard, his eyes distant. Beyond the walls, the magical creatures of the surrounding lands behaved in ways that terrified those who had spent their lives studying them. The acromantulas of the Forbidden Forest abandoned their nests and fled southward in vast, panicked columns. The Strauss refused to leave the ground, folding their wings tight to their bodies and staring toward the castle as though awaiting judgment. Even the Dementors, drawn always to despair, began gathering in unnatural numbers along the edges of the wards, not to attack, but to watch. They did not glide toward the presence within Hogwarts. They circled it from a distance, as one circles a fire too great to approach. The Order of the Phoenix met in secret at Grimmauld Place. Sirius Black paced like a caged wolf. Remus Lupin sat with his hands folded, his werewolf senses telling him things his mind refused to translate. Kingsley Shacklebolt spoke of the Auror reports with the measured voice of a man who no longer trusted his own certainty. Molly Weasley wept quietly for the students, for her children, for the world she had always believed she understood. Dumbledore spoke last. Their goal, he told them, was not to defeat this being. It was to observe him, to understand him, to learn whether understanding was even possible. The operation went wrong before it began. Spells cast within 100 paces of Sukuna's presence twisted in the air like ribbons in a storm. Shield charms simply ceased to exist. A Patronus, cast in desperation, dissolved into mist before the caster could give it shape. Sukuna walked among them without hurry, without violence, without any obvious effort. He moved as though gravity itself was a matter of politeness rather than law. When he lifted his hand, the ground beneath the Order members softened. When he tilted his head, the light around them dimmed. He demonstrated only fragments of what he was capable of, and those fragments were enough. Yet in the middle of the encounter he stopped. His eyes lifted toward the highest tower, then downward toward the deep foundations beneath their feet. Something ancient had noticed him, something asleep within the walls. He listened for it the way a wolf listens to a distant song, and for the first time since his arrival in this world, his amusement gave way to something else. Interest, genuine, patient interest. He turned from the Order without finishing what he had begun and walked back into the castle, leaving them standing bewildered in a field of shattered spellwork. Lupin whispered that they had just been spared. Kingsley shook his head slowly. They had not been spared. They had been forgotten. Inside the castle, Sukuna descended. He passed through corridors that adjusted themselves for his footsteps, through stairwells that turned to meet him. Somewhere beneath the dungeons, in a chamber that had no map, an old magic waited for him, instinctive, almost breathing, older than the founders, older than the language of wizards. It watched him arrive, and it did not flinch. For the first time since he had been dragged into this world, The King of Curses paused at a doorway and considered the possibility that something within it might be worth the effort of caution. Dumbledore did not sleep for 3 nights. In the private archives beneath the headmaster's tower, in a chamber known only to those who had held his office, he read scrolls that had not been unrolled in over 600 years. The parchment was so old that it hummed faintly when touched, as though the ink itself remembered the hands that had written it. What he read there rearranged everything he had ever believed about the origins of his craft. Long before wands were shaped from wood and core, long before Latin gave magic its familiar cadence, humanity had lived in a world haunted by things born from its own fear. They had no names, for names would have given them shape. They fed on despair, on cruelty, on the invisible weight of unspoken grief. The earliest sorcerers, those whose portraits no longer hung anywhere in the wizarding world, did not defeat these entities. They could not. They sealed them, one by one, and then sealed the memory of their existence. Magic as it was practiced today had been designed quite deliberately to lead humanity away from the darkness those first wizards had faced. Every incantation, every wand movement, every carefully catalogued spell was a step further from the truth of what magic had once been forced to confront. Sukuna was not one of those ancient entities. Dumbledore realized this with a slow, sinking certainty. Sukuna was something worse. He was a human being who had walked the path those old wizards had spent millennia hiding, and had walked it willingly, until humanity itself had fallen away from him like a garment he no longer required. He was proof that the darkness they had sealed away had never truly been outside of them. Harry sat beside the headmaster's desk when this was explained to him, and for a long while he did not speak. He had spent his short life believing that his purpose was written into the shape of his scar, that destiny had chosen him because destiny required someone to be chosen. Now he was being told that destiny itself was a comforting fiction, that the war he had been raised to fight was only the most recent chapter in a story so old that even the wizarding world had chosen to forget it. He looked at Dumbledore and for the first time saw fear in the old man's eyes, and understood that fear was not weakness, it was recognition. Hermione, when she learned of what had been hidden, wept quietly in a corner of the library. Not from sorrow, but from a rage she had no vocabulary for. Knowledge, the one thing she had trusted absolutely, had been curated, filtered, withheld. Entire civilizations of understanding had been buried so that children like her could grow up believing the world was smaller and safer than it was. Snape found her there and, in a rare moment untouched by cruelty, admitted that the magical world had built its civilization upon comforting lies, and that lies of that magnitude did not stay buried forever. Below them all, in the chamber beneath the dungeons, Sukuna stood before an old and waiting presence. It had no body, it had no voice. It was the collected consciousness of the 4 founders, or something older still, that had taken shelter within their work. It did not attack him, it did not flee. It regarded him with the patience of stone, and it asked him, without sound, a single question that he alone could hear. Can one who has become absolute evil ever choose restraint? Sukuna did not answer. He stood in the silence of that chamber for a long time, his forearms still at his sides, his gaze fixed on nothing. For the first time in his existence he had been challenged not by strength but by judgment, not by a warrior but by a witness. He could have shattered the chamber. He could have burned the consciousness within it to nothing. He did neither. He turned and walked away, and the silence that followed him carried a weight he had never known before. Above them all, Hogwarts held its breath. Something in its stones had recognized him, not as a stranger, as an echo of a story it had once been built to forget. Voldemort felt the arrival of Sukuna the way a spider feels the wrong footstep on its web. From the crumbling manor where he had made his throne, he stared into the fire for hours without moving. His pale fingers curled tightly around the yew of his wand. His Horcruxes, scattered across Britain, hummed with an unease he had never designed into them. The fragment inside Nagini trembled. The fragment inside Harry recoiled. The fragment inside the diadem, hidden in a room only the castle remembered, whispered warnings into a silence no one heard. He did not confront the intruder. Not yet. Voldemort had built his life upon the principle that no power should exist, that he could not eventually make his own, and so, rather than face Sukuna as an enemy, he chose to view him as a resource, a weapon of impossible potential waiting to be turned. If the King of Curses could be studied, understood, and eventually seized, then Voldemort would become something greater than any wizard had ever been. He gave the order, and Britain burned. Death Eaters struck across the country in coordinated waves, drawing the attention of the Ministry, the Order, and the wizarding press away from Hogwarts. Diagon Alley smoldered under a sky the color of bruises. Muggle-born families vanished from their homes without a trace. The Ministry, already paralyzed by the reports coming out of the castle, collapsed inward under the weight of contradictory demands. Officials resigned. Others were replaced by imperiused strangers wearing familiar faces. Fudge's successor could not hold the room during meetings, and the Wizengamot began to fracture along lines that had not been visible in living memory. Hogwarts began to empty. Parents arrived by flue and portkey to remove their children, some in tears, some in fury, some in silence too heavy for words. Molly Weasley clutched Ginny to her chest and refused, for the first time in her life, to trust Dumbledore's judgment. Trust, that fragile inheritance of a long peace, was disappearing faster than the wards could be rebuilt. Sukuna watched the war unfold with the mild interest of a traveler observing a distant thunderstorm. The scale of it did not impress him. He had seen larger conflicts on smaller worlds. What did draw his attention briefly was the moment Voldemort finally made his move. In the ruins of an abandoned chapel in the north, the Dark Lord gathered his most loyal servants and attempted to bind Sukuna's essence through a ritual of soul magic older than the founding of the Ministry. It was, in Voldemort's mind, the culmination of decades of study. The ritual reached across the distance between them and, for a single breathless moment, touched the surface of Sukuna's soul. What Voldemort experienced in that moment could not be described in any language he possessed. It was not power. Power he understood. What he felt was hatred so vast, so ancient, so utterly free of any hope of redemption, that his own carefully cultivated cruelty appeared, by comparison, to be the tantrum of a spoiled child. He felt the weight of every life Sukuna had ever ended, and every life he had ended without effort, and every life he had ended with pleasure, all pressing against the walls of Voldemort's mind at once. The Dark Lord screamed. His followers did not know why. He broke the ritual himself, collapsing to his knees, gasping, and for the first time since his rebirth, Lord Voldemort felt something he had spent his entire life outrunning: fear. He retreated to his manor and did not emerge for 2 days. Hogwarts, meanwhile, suffered. The ancient protections woven into its walls, awakened but not yet fully understood, began to strain under the pressure of everything the castle was trying to hold at once. Allies of the Order began to question Dumbledore openly. Some accused him of hoarding knowledge, others accused him of hesitation. Harry, standing on the edge of the lake at dusk, admitted to Hermione that he no longer knew whether courage would be enough. Magic, he said quietly, had never faced an enemy like this. And the ones who wielded magic best were beginning to look very small against the darkness they had inherited. Every thread of the story drew itself toward Hogwarts on the night of the convergence. The Order came first, ragged from a season of running battles, their robes stained and their faces older than they had been a month earlier. The Ministry, what remained of it, sent its last coherent detachment of Aurors, men and women who had chosen to stand rather than to flee. Voldemort came too, driven by a hunger that had grown stronger than his fear, his Death Eaters marching behind him in ranks that no longer felt like triumph. And beneath them all, deep in the foundations of the castle, the old magic of the Founders stirred fully awake, ready at last to be seen. They collided in the great courtyard beneath the shattered clock tower. For a moment before the first spell was cast, there was only silence. And in that silence, every fighter present understood that whatever happened here would not be remembered as a battle. It would be remembered as a hinge upon which history turned. Sukuna stood at the center of it all, and he was smiling. Dumbledore did not raise his wand. He walked forward alone, past the frightened students who had refused evacuation, past the trembling Aurors, past the Death Eaters who watched him with a hatred edged by confusion. He walked until he stood before Sukuna, And then he spoke quietly, so that only the King of Curses could hear him. "We cannot defeat you," he said. "I understand that now. Magic shapes reality. Cursed energy shapes the soul. One cannot overcome the other by force. But there is one thing your kind has never learned, and one thing mine has always known." Sukuna tilted his head. He was interested. He had always been interested. "Sacrifice," Dumbledore said, "not as weakness, as choice." Behind him, Harry stepped forward. He had grown thinner in the last weeks, but his eyes had grown steadier. He carried no weapon that any of them recognized. In his hands he held only a small shard of stone, drawn from a chamber beneath the castle that only the Founder's consciousness had shown him. Hermione had explained what it was. She had explained what it would cost. Harry had listened, and he had chosen anyway. The battle began then, and it was mythic. Voldemort struck at Dumbledore in one final howling attempt to end their long war. Death Eaters fell upon the Order, and the Order met them with the fury of people who had nothing left to lose. Above them, the sky over Hogwarts fractured into ribbons of light that had not been seen since the age of the Founders. The castle itself fought. Statues stepped from their pedestals. Suits of armor moved without command. The Grey Lady walked among the wounded and whispered comfort into the ears of the dying. The bloody Baron stood at the gates and turned back Dementors with a look. Peeves, of all beings, hurled candlesticks from the highest tower with a joyful, terrifying precision. Sukuna unleashed techniques that this world had never been meant to witness. Reality bent around him. Space itself opened at his gesture, revealing a domain within which no wand could function. And yet, for the first time in centuries, he did not fight to end. He fought to see. He wanted to know whether these humans could truly understand what they had claimed. He wanted to know whether sacrifice was a word or a truth. Harry stepped into the domain. He carried the shard of stone in one hand and, in the other, a willingness to lose himself that only he had been capable of offering. He spoke the old activation the Founder's consciousness had taught him, and the ancient magic of Hogwarts poured through him like a river breaking a dam. The castle answered. Every stone, every portrait, every ghost, every buried protection woven into the ground beneath the lake. All of it flowed through the boy and into the fracture Sukuna's presence had opened between worlds. Sukuna could have killed him. It would have been easy. It would have been quick. He did not. He watched Harry Potter burn with a light that was not power but purpose, and he understood at last what Dumbledore had meant. These humans, so fragile, so limited in their magic, had chosen to spend themselves rather than to conquer. There was no victory to be taken from them, only witness. Dumbledore raised his wand only at the end, and even then not to strike. He chose compassion over domination. He offered Sukuna the one thing the King of Curses had never been given: respect without submission, recognition without fear. The dimensional fracture closed with a sound like a great door shutting on a distant hall. Sukuna was drawn back into it, unhurried, unbroken, and, for the briefest instant, thoughtful. He was not defeated. He was returned. And as he vanished, he looked once at Dumbledore, once at Harry, and inclined his head. The courtyard fell silent. Hogwarts had held. Months passed before the castle felt like itself again, and even then, it was not the same castle it had been. The stones had been cleaned. The shattered towers had been rebuilt. The lake had settled into its ordinary green calm. Yet those who had lived through the convergence walked its corridors differently now, as though listening for a sound they could not quite place. Students spoke more softly. Laughter returned, but it carried a new gentleness, the kind found in people who had learned that noise is a privilege rather than a right. The professors taught with a humility none of them had possessed before. Charms lessons began with silence. Transfiguration exercises included, for the first time in a century, a moment of quiet reflection before the wand was raised. History of magic, once the least attended class in the school, filled to capacity, because the students had come to understand that history was not a list of names but a warning left behind by those who had survived long enough to write. The ministry, humbled by the near collapse of its own institutions, began the slow and painful work of rewriting the record. Scholars were commissioned to examine the sealed archives Dumbledore had opened. Curriculums were revised. Forbidden sections of the library were unlocked for supervised study. Not everyone approved. Some traditions had grown too comfortable to surrender. But the truth, once released, was not easily returned to its cage. Harry walked the grounds often that autumn, alone or with Hermione, and sometimes with Ron, in an easy quiet that required no explanation. He had come to understand in the weeks after the battle that courage was not the absence of terror. Courage was the choice to stand before something incomprehensible, something that could unmake you, and refuse to surrender the small, stubborn thing inside you that remained your own. He no longer thought of himself as chosen. He thought of himself as answerable. It was, he found, a heavier and better weight to carry. Dumbledore sat often by his window in the headmaster's tower, watching the seasons turn, and reflected on the true danger Sukuna had brought with him. It had not been his power, though his power had been immense. It had been the temptation his existence offered, the temptation to believe that overwhelming force was the only path to survival. Many wizards, in the quiet moments after the battle, had asked themselves whether the world might be safer if their side possessed such strength. Dumbledore knew that question would return, in different mouths for generations, and he knew, too, that the answer would always require the same difficult courage the boy had shown. Certain corridors in the castle remained permanently altered. A stairwell near the astronomy tower now ended in a landing that had not existed before, and no one could quite recall where it had once led. A single window on the 7th floor refused to accept enchantment, remaining stubbornly ordinary, as though the castle had decided to keep one honest witness to what had passed. The house elves avoided that window without ever saying why. Far away in a world of cursed energy and broken sorcerers, Sukuna sat upon a throne of ruin and considered, for the briefest moment, the world of wands and ancient stone. He dismissed its magic as inferior, as he dismissed most things, but he could not dismiss the people. He could not dismiss the old man who had spoken to him without fear. He could not dismiss the boy who had burned himself into a shield rather than a sword. For perhaps the first time in centuries, he had encountered opponents whose resolve, not their strength, had earned a measure of his respect. He did not speak of them, he never would, but he remembered. In the Department of Mysteries, the unspeakables gathered once more around the shattered remains of their original experiment. Within the ruined runes, a faint trace of unfamiliar energy still lingered, refusing every classification, resisting every attempt to name it. The barrier between realities, they realized, was thinner than they had ever imagined. And somewhere in the highest gallery of Hogwarts, an ancient portrait that had not spoken in 600 years opened its painted eyes and whispered, to no one at all, a warning left behind by those who had come before. He was not the first to cross between worlds, only the first to leave.